There are good and bad erratas, but in general, the player base doesn't like them at all. In this video, we're going to go over some of the more hated ones of all time. And starting at number 10, we have Darkness Approaches. This is a normal spell card, which effect now reads, discard 2 cards from your hand to target a face-up monster and change it to face-down defense position. Darkness Approaches is really emblematic of how Konami was handling the game at its earliest stages. That is, they weren't thinking very much about it. This card's original printing actually says to flip the monster face down without changing its battle position, making this the one and only card that could ever allow you to have a monster in face down attack position, which isn't a thing codified by the rules at all. It also led to some bizarre and pretty unintuitive rulings. It is an attack position, but you can't really attack with it since it has no stats, right? That just feels wrong. You can still flip summon the card later, and it gets flipped into attack position as usual. Really, the biggest change is that if your opponent attacks into it, it will use its attack rather than its defense for that battle. But most good flip monsters didn't really have decent stats anyway. And even then, since you had to change a monster on the field, it's not like you could surprise your opponent with it either. What is sad about this errata is that it just made the card go from a whimsical reminder of the game's roots to being completely pointless, as it is just an objectively worse Book of Moon now, with the new text removing its uniqueness entirely. Still, at least this was a card that was never really competitive in the first place, so people didn't care that much about it, making it a good pick for number 10. And at number 9, we have Mind Crush. This is a normal trap card with the effect which makes you declare one card name, and if that card is in your opponent's hand, they must discard all copies of it. Otherwise, you discard one random card from your hand. Okay, so admittedly, what happened with Mind Crush wasn't as much of an errata as it was a ruling change, but it basically acted as an errata to this card's effect as far as things were concerned. It used to be that if you played a card that interacted with a hidden zone, such as the hand, your opponent would also have to show you what they had to confirm you indeed had taken all the targets out. This usually made Mind Crush into a much better card, since, though you could hold it for your opponent's searching, if you had to shotgun it and you missed, you would still at least get to look at your opponent's hand and play with full information, even if it cost you a discard. This was a pretty controversial rulings change, all things considered, since it could be seen as a way to benefit cheaters, as they can just say they don't have the card in hand. That said, people aren't going to be willing to risk a game or match loss for cheating if they get caught, and also Mind Crush was a tad too strong in the way it worked before, to the point where it was even limited for a good while, so it was probably a needed change all things considered. And at number 8, we have the Dark Magician of Chaos. This is a level 8 Dark Spellcaster with 2800 attack and 2600 defense. During the end phase, if this card was normal or special summoned, you can target one spell in your graveyard and add it to your hand. Also, if this card destroys a monster by battle, you banish that opponent's monster. Lastly, if this face-up card were to leave the field, it's banished instead. The changes to Dark Magician of Chaos were that its effects made it into a hard once per turn, and it only lets you retrieve the spell during the end phase. This is going to be the first of many cases where the controversy was how they nerfed an iconic and powerful card all the way into uselessness. Dark Magician of Chaos had to be limited pretty early on, due to how it gets set up with combo cards that let you cheat it out like Premature Burial, since it gave you a huge body that would at least refund itself by getting another powerful spell from your graveyard, and probably a rightfully limited one at that too. Still, using it like this was perhaps the fairest way to abuse the card. For a while, there were decks just dedicated to getting the Dark Magician of Chaos and looping it together with cards like Reasoning and Monster Gate. Demok does banish itself if it leaves the field, but that means it can form an essential infinite loop when comboed with Dimension Fusion, and this forms the backbone for a really powerful deck in GOAT format. This card became too powerful when it reached Dad format, where it helped a yet another amazing dark monster that could let you recycle your Reborn or draw cards. It is the sort of card where you can clearly see why it can never come back with its old effect, but at the same time, coming back so nerfed is essentially the same as having the card be in the ban list forever anyways, which is the issue with most cards on this list. And at number 7, we have Brain Control. This is a normal spell card, which allows you to pay 800 life points, then target one face-up monster your opponent controls that can be normal summoned or set, and then you take control of that target until the end phase. The big errata to this card was adding the restriction, where it has to take only a normal summonable or settable monster. This essentially disables you from stealing any extra deck or Nami monsters. This just makes this card too narrow to ever see play, and basically useless in the modern era, where your opponent probably isn't ever ending on their normal summon, and if they do, it's because you stopped them. Either way, for a bit of context, this card, back when it was legal, was quickly limited to 1 due to how powerful it was. It was just a slightly nerfed change of heart, where the only meaningful distinction was that you couldn't take flips. This card used to be a powerhouse, and many games were ended because of it all the way up until it got banned. This left Mind Control as the only good generic stealing card in the game, which is much more balanced than Brain Control since the monster can't be tributed or attacked. The errata came out in 2017 and felt proper for a while, but it became clear that with time, Mind Control was doing the same thing as this card anyway. Not attacking and not being able to tribute became less and less relevant as you got more ways to convert bodies off the field. So here's the big thing about this card. This effect just isn't that good anymore, and it could probably have its errata reversed and it would see no play. We have 3 mind controls and also both Snatch Steal and Change of Heart legal again, the latter of which was just put to 3 in the latest list, so it's doubtful having more copies of this effect around would really change anything. And at number 6, we have Yugioh Guardian. This is a level 6 Earth Warrior Synchro with 2800 attack. It takes an Earth Tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters to bring out. Its effect is that when it destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you special summon that monster to your side of the field in defense position. The errata for this changed, requiring a generic tuner to specifically be an Earth Tuner. This was just a really weird change to the card all around. I mean, yeah, Yugioh Guardian was one of the strongest generic synchros back in the day, to the point where it even spent some time on the ban list. This was one of the scariest cards to have dropped on you in the 2010s, for sure. However, its errata dropped only in Duelist Saga almost a decade after that, when people probably wouldn't play Yugioh Guardian even if it had an extra 1000 attack. Mind you that we got Zodiacs the same year as Yugioh Guardian's errata dropped, and the justification just didn't make any sense to us. The OCG supposedly errated it to be able to unban it, since they were still fearful of the card all that time later. But the TCG already had Yugioh Guardian come back to little fanfare at the beginning of the Pendulum era, and we were pushing into Link monsters by now. All of this errata ended up doing is printing a ton of new Yugioh Guardian copies, which people wouldn't play in modern decks, nor even want to add to their retro decks since its text is mismatched with how it was used back then. And at number 5, we have Sinister Serpent. This is a level 1 water reptile effect monster with 300 attack and 250 defense. Its effect is that during your standby phase, if this card is in your graveyard, you can add it to your hand. Also, banish 1 Sinister Serpent from your graveyard during your opponent's next end phase. And you can only use this effect of Sinister Serpent once per turn. Okay, so besides the obvious hard once per turn, this card also made you banish a Sinister Serpent during your opponent's end phase. Sinister Serpent used to be played as a recursive card advantage engine, as the old version pretty much just added itself back to your hand during every standby phase. This made it into basically Treeborn Frog before that was even a thing, and with no restrictions. Though it wasn't really good tribute fodder since it would come back to your hand, it was perfect to combo with all kinds of discard traps. It was played as a card advantage engine in pretty much every single deck all the way up until it was banned. Premium Gold 2 would give us the fixed version, more or less 10 years since it got sent to the Forbidden list. This was an errata that felt off due to similar reasons to the last couple of cards on this list. That is, if they just brought Sinister Serpent back as it was back then, it probably wouldn't have seen play. Yeah, discard traps were still seen play at the time, but it was more because they would let you trigger graveyard effects during your opponent's turn. Again, Treeborn Frog was a thing, and getting a body on the field is generally going to be better than having an extra card in hand. Nowadays, Konami is content with printing much better cards that come back to your hand during every standby phase, with very few restrictions, making the now self-banishing Sinister Serpent look even sillier in comparison. And at number 4, we have Destiny Hero Disc Commander. This is a level 10 Dark Warrior effect monster. It cannot be special summoned from the graveyard the turn it was sent to the grave, but if special summoned from the grave, you can draw 2 cards. But you can only use this effect once per duel. So yeah, this is yet another case of an errata totally murdering the card. but this one felt somewhat earned. Back then, Disc Commander had neither a once per duel clause nor the restriction on when it could be special summoned back. Heck, it wasn't even a hard once per turn, and in decks built to abuse it, it wasn't uncommon to trigger the effect multiple times a turn. It was played as the backbone of the best draw engine for dad decks due to Destiny Draw, which lets you discard a Destiny Hero monster to draw 2 cards. This starts putting darks in the graveyard while also setting up a Destiny Hero Disc Commander to later be brought back through various means for even bigger explosion in card advantage. Dad was the face of the Tier 0 format, but Destiny Hero Disc Commander was certainly quite problematic itself, earning itself its stay on the forbidden list. That said, while this card couldn't really come back the way it was, as God knows how much modern hero could use a non-once per turn draw 2, the next text does make it feel like a waste of cardboard now. Being something you have to set up during your own turn to maybe reborn the soonest during your opponent's turn through some means is too much to set up, and the once per duel restriction just makes it all the more laughable, as if it wouldn't be enough of an achievement to draw 2 with this at all as you play. And at number 3, we have Crush Card Virus. This is a normal trap card whose current text reads, tribute 1 dark monster with 1,000 or less attack as a cost. Then your opponent takes no damage until the end of the next turn after this card resolves. Also, you look at your opponent's hand and all monsters they control, and if you do, destroy the monsters among them with 1,500 or more attack. Then your opponent can destroy up to 3 monsters with 1,500 or more attack in their deck. So this is one of the erratas that added a bunch of new effects and restrictions to a card while not changing the core idea. Before, it wouldn't have the damage prevention effect. It would allow you to look at your opponent's next draw for the next 3 turns and also destroy them if they had 1,500 or more attack. And it would not let your opponent get essentially 3 Foolish Burials for free either. Now, the original Crush Card Virus was a really controversial card in of itself. It was available exclusively as a prize card for winning an SJC, the equivalent to a modern YCS, for a really long time. This meant a single copy would run you at least a couple $1,000s, and that was decades ago. The card was also just as OP as you would imagine, with most good monsters being within its threshold. The few who could get access to this card would go out of their way to play it, to the point where even a deck that had no natural targets for it, like Gladiator Beast, would splash Sandgan and DD Crow just to have some monsters they could tribute for a Crush Card Virus. This card really did give you an instant win most times it resolved, as it would rip your opponent's best plays and let you play with full information. Pro teams used to hoard copies of it and distribute it only amongst themselves, making the game feel even more lopsided. The controversies didn't even stop when it got reprinted, since it was hilariously short printed, to the point where it would still cost you over $100 for 1 copy. It was eventually banned alongside many other Dark Good Stuff cards in the Dad Return format. It came back a bit after the Duelist Alliance era, where even with the plethora of nerfs, it was somehow an okay card still. It was played in Burning Abyss since pretty much all their monsters were targets, and it was amazing versus Cleafort and Necros, where it would be able to hand rip them for most of what they had. Neither deck particularly cared about getting 3 Foolish Burials either, and the turn of no damage wouldn't matter much since the Burning Abyss player could just use it to accumulate even more resources through Dante, Traveler of the Burning Abyss. Still, this is another errata people hated due to how it erased the original from the game forever, though it was still one of the most playable post-errata cards around. But it loses in that to the next spot on this list, probably for the worst. And now, for the runner-up at number 2, we have Imperial Order. This is a continuous trap card whose effect is to negate all spell effects on the field. However, during both players' standby phases, you must pay 700 life points, and this is not optional, or this card is destroyed. So, coming off a bunch of cards where the errata simply killed the card, we arrive at the first and probably only case of a card remaining overpowered after it got changed. They really only added a single parenthesis to this card's effect, making it so that the 700 life point payment was not optional, and happened during both players' turns instead of just yours. Before that, Imperial Order was a really obnoxious card that had to be banned really early on. You could just trigger all your own power spells during your turn, then have Imperial Order ready to negate all of your opponents for a whole turn cycle, and then you could just choose not to pay its maintenance cost during your standby phase so that you could bury your opponent with even more advantage. This was obviously an awful play pattern. And though the errata did aim to take away some of that, the card was still hilariously unbalanced and should never have been brought back. In 2017, when they finally unbanned Imperial Order, it just went on to become an instant staple. Since it's a trap card that you only have to flip during your opponent's turn, its effect will never get even close to being as symmetrical as it reads the first time. You always get the first opportunity to dump your hand, then lock the opponent out entirely out of the most important card type when going second. Having your own Imperial Order blocking you basically did not matter when the average game length was already shifting to only a few hours, even at the time. Also, most decks just had really easy ways to out their own Imperial Order anyway, be it through Zodiac Trident or Baronne de Fleur, if they really wanted to. Still, despite being an obnoxious going first card, which could make trap decks feel invincible, while completely hosing down spell-based decks like Sky Striker and Invoked, the existence of this errata just made Konami refuse to ban this card for some reason. It went on to be legal for 4 years after that. 4 long years of seeing a ridiculous amount of play in both main and side decks, before they could finally admit their mistake and rightfully ban it, making Imperial Order into one of the most hated errata cards ever. And last but not least, at number 1, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This is a level 8 Dark Dragon effect monster with 3000 attack and 2500 defense. It can't be normal summon or set, and must be special summoned from your hand by banishing a light and dark monster from your grave. Once per turn, it lets you pay 1000 life points to send as many cards in both players' hands and on the field as possible to the graveyard. Then, inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each card sent to your opponent's graveyard in this way. However, you cannot activate other cards or effects during the turn you activate this card's effect. The errata being, obviously, the very last line of this card's effect. Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End, or CED for short, is, in its original form, one of the strongest Yu-Gi-Oh cards ever printed. For the very low setup of just having any light or dark in your grave, this card puts both players to 0 cards. But your opponent also gets a hefty burn out of it. It is important to note that the burn damage used to be 300 for every card sent this way, and not just to your opponent's graveyard. Meaning, seeing 3000 plus out of this card alone was not uncommon. Also, remember that it was really difficult to stop this effect due to old priority rules. Neither Torrential Tribute nor Regeki Break could prevent it. Almost nothing short of negating its summon entirely with Solemn Judgment could, really. And while having both players at 0 would in theory favor your opponent more, since they will get a shot at the draw phase first, well, what if you were to activate it while having a monster with a graveyard effect out on the field to break parity, such as a Sangan? Then you can go and fetch a good normal summon like Yatagarasu, which prevents your opponent from drawing for turn if it damages them. What we've just described was the dreadful Yada Lock combo, which ruined one of the first Yu-Gi-Oh! World tournaments and is the main reason why we have fully banned cards now, rather than just limiting them to 1. Either way, this is obviously a crazy powerful card that should never be allowed to come back, especially if it could coexist with modern graveyard effects. That said, this is yet another case where it is frustrating to see this card's legacy being destroyed by an errata that just makes it into an entirely different card. At least this card got an appropriate modern retrain in Chaos Emperor, the Dragon of Armageddon, which was playable for a while and thankfully isn't as obnoxious as the original CED. Still, most of these kinds of erratas are controversial, since having it be like this really is the same as just having never unbanned the card in the first place. It really does make you wonder why some of these cards are like this, while others are just accepted to be permanent fixtures on the ban list like Magical Scientist and Graceful Charity. CED is the one that exemplifies this disparity the most, going from what was once one of the most powerful cards in the game to now being worse than most pack filler out there. And that's why it's number 1 spot on this list.